August 7, 1944. 423 hours. The town of Mortain, Normandy, France. 22-year-old Sergeant Earl Peterson lay flat beneath a disabled M4A1 Sherman tank, his body pressed against soil that still radiated heat from yesterday's sun, now mixing with the cold tremor of distant artillery that was getting closer every minute. The final drive assembly above his head was leaking transmission fluid at a rate that would leave the tank completely immobilized within 30 minutes. And the German 2nd SS Panzer Division was approximately 8 kilometers away, advancing toward this position with 47 operational Panther tanks and the explicit mission to cut through the American lines and reach the coast. Earl's hands worked in near-total darkness, guided more by touch than sight, using a modified 9/16-inch box wrench that he'd altered 3 weeks ago with a bench grinder and 63 cents worth of hardware store parts. The wrench had a 15-degree offset bend that he'd heated and hammered into the handle, allowing it to reach a recessed bolt on the final drive housing that standard wrenches couldn't access. In his left hand, he held a battered tin of railway coupling grease that his father had sent from the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad maintenance shops back in Wisconsin. Thick, black, petroleum-based lubricant designed for bearing surfaces that had to handle 50-ton freight cars, not 33-ton tanks. The Sherman's crew commander, Lieutenant James Kovach, was standing beside the tank, splitting his attention between Earl's legs, protruding from beneath the vehicle and the eastern horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to gray the darkness. "Peterson, we got maybe 10 minutes before we got to move this position or fight from here. Can you fix it?" Earl didn't answer immediately because talking while working took precious seconds he didn't have. The final drive on the Sherman tank was the weak point in an otherwise reliable machine, a reduction gearbox that took the high-speed rotation from the transmission and reduced it to the lower speed, higher torque needed to turn the tracks. The gearbox contained spiral bevel gears, pinion gears, and a complex arrangement of bearings that were supposed to be lubricated by the transmission fluid circulating through the system. Except the seals failed. They failed constantly, predictably, and catastrophically, especially after the tank had been operated for more than 200 miles in combat conditions, with the constant shock loading from rough terrain, sudden stops, and violent maneuvers. When the seals failed, transmission fluid leaked out. When the fluid level dropped below critical, the gears ran dry. When gears ran dry at high load, they overheated and wore rapidly. When the wear became severe enough, the teeth stripped, the bearings seized, and the tank became a 40,000-pound steel pillbox that couldn't move. The official Army procedure was to replace the entire final drive assembly, a job that required a maintenance depot, a crane to lift the track assembly off the tank, specialized tools, and approximately 16 hours of skilled labor per side. Earl had figured out how to fix it in 47 minutes using hand tools and materials he could carry in his pockets. The trick was understanding what was actually failing and why. The Army's technical manuals blamed the seal design, which was partially correct. The seals were inadequate for the application, rubber compounds that degraded under heat and pressure. But replacing the seals didn't solve the problem for long, because the real issue was that the gears and bearings were already damaged by the time anyone noticed the leak. Earl had realized something during his second week in France, working 16-hour shifts at the 3rd Armored Division Maintenance Depot near Utah Beach. He'd noticed that tanks with final drive failures showed a consistent pattern. The seals always failed on the same side first, usually the right side. The failure always occurred after approximately 200 to 250 miles of operation, and the wear pattern on the gears when he disassembled failed units showed scoring, and heat discoloration concentrated on specific tooth faces. That meant the problem wasn't random. It was systematic, related to how the tanks were being operated. American tank drivers had been trained to make sharp right turns more frequently than left turns when maneuvering in combat. Right turns positioned the tank's bow machine gun and main gun toward threats more quickly in typical engagement scenarios where enemies appeared to the right of advance. Right turns also loaded the right final drive more heavily because of the tank's weight distribution, with the driver seated on the left side of the hull. The constant heavy loading on right turns was generating more heat in the right final drive. The heat was degrading the seals faster. The degraded seals were leaking fluid, and once the fluid level dropped even slightly, the damage accelerated catastrophically because the gears were no longer adequately lubricated during the highest stress operating conditions. The Army's solution was replacement. Earl's solution was prevention, through a modification that took 11 minutes to perform and cost 63 cents in parts. He'd taken a standard 9/16-inch box-end wrench, the kind that cost 12 cents at any hardware store, and modified it by heating the handle until the steel was red hot, then bending it 15 degrees using a blacksmith's technique he'd learned from his father. The bend created an offset that allowed the wrench to reach a drain plug on the bottom of the final drive housing that was normally accessible only by removing the track, a 4-hour job per side. With access to that drain plug, Earl could drain the existing contaminated transmission fluid from the final drive, inspect it for metal particles that indicated gear wear, and determine whether the unit needed replacement or could be serviced in place. More importantly, he could add lubricant directly to the final drive without waiting for it to circulate through the entire transmission system. The lubricant was the second part of his modification. Standard Army transmission fluid was SAE 50 weight motor oil, appropriate for the transmission itself but too thin for the high-pressure bearing surfaces in the final drive, when seals began to leak and fluid levels dropped. Earl's railway coupling grease was SAE 140 weight, more than twice as thick, with extreme pressure additives designed for metal-to-metal contact under enormous loads. The grease was too thick to use in the main transmission, but perfect for the final drive gears and bearings. His procedure was simple. Drain the thin transmission fluid from the final drive using the modified wrench to access the drain plug. Clean the magnetic drain plug of metal particles. Pack the final drive housing with approximately 14 ounces of railway coupling grease, working it into the gear mesh and bearing surfaces. Replace the drain plug and add fresh transmission fluid to the main system to replace what had been drained. The thick grease stayed in the final drive, providing lubrication even when seals leaked and fluid levels dropped. The modification didn't fix the seals, but it kept the gears and bearings from destroying themselves while waiting for proper seal replacement at a depot facility. More critically, it kept tanks operational in combat when depot maintenance wasn't possible. Earl had performed his first emergency field modification on July 14, 1944, on a Sherman from Company C, 33rd Armored Regiment, that had suffered final drive failure during the Battle for St. Lo. The tank had been declared deadlined, waiting for evacuation to depot for final drive replacement. Earl had obtained permission from the maintenance officer to attempt a field repair as an experiment. He'd used his modified wrench to drain and repack the final drive with railway coupling grease. 6 hours later, the tank was back in action. It operated for another 180 miles before requiring actual depot maintenance, far exceeding anyone's expectations. Word spread among the armored units. Tank commanders began requesting Earl specifically when their Shermans developed final drive problems. By late July, he'd trained 12 other mechanics in his technique. By early August, the modification was being performed throughout 3rd Armored Division without official authorization from Army Ordnance Department. Now, lying beneath Lieutenant Kovach's tank with German panzers closing in, Earl was performing the modification for the 47th time. His hands moved through the sequence automatically. Modified wrench on the drain plug, counterclockwise rotation against the resistance of 2 months of accumulated carbon and heat. The plug came free and contaminated transmission fluid poured onto the ground beside Earl's head, black and evil-smelling, carrying with it fine metallic particles that glittered in his flashlight beam. He pulled the magnetic drain plug completely out and inspected it. The magnet was coated with metal fuzz, steel particles shed from gear teeth under excessive wear. Not catastrophic yet, but getting there. Without his modification, this tank would be dead within 50 miles. With it, the tank might make another 200 miles before requiring depot service. Earl reached for the tin of railway grease, scooped out a handful of the thick black compound, and began working it up into the final drive housing through the drain hole. The grease was stiff in the cool morning air, requiring force to push it past the gears and into the bearing surfaces. He could feel the metal components through the grease, smooth where they were unworn, rough where teeth had been scoring against each other. 14 ounces of grease, applied systematically to ensure complete coverage. 2 minutes per ounce, 28 minutes total for proper application. He didn't have 28 minutes. The artillery sound was changing character, individual impacts becoming distinguishable from the general rumble, which meant the German barrage was getting closer, walking toward American positions as forward observers corrected fire. "Peterson!" Kovach's voice was tight. "We got movement on the ridge. Infantry, looks like. Maybe 800 meters. We need to be mobile now." Earl forced the pace, packing grease faster, accepting less than perfect coverage in exchange for speed. Get enough lubricant into the critical areas, replace the drain plug, refill the transmission, and get this tank back into the fight before the German assault hit their position. The 30th Infantry Division was holding Mortain with approximately 4,000 men against what intelligence estimated as 15,000 Germans in the attacking force. The Germans had total surprise, had attacked at night, and were advancing with overwhelming local superiority. The only thing stopping the 2nd SS Panzer Division from reaching the coast and cutting off the entire American breakout from Normandy was a thin line of infantry, a handful of tank destroyers, and whatever Sherman tanks could be kept operational. This tank, with its freshly repacked final drive, might make the difference between holding the position and watching the German counteroffensive succeed. That was the reality of mechanized warfare in 1944. The side that could keep its vehicles moving won. The side that lost mobility lost battles. Earl had understood this instinctively from his first day in France, and he dedicated himself to keeping American tanks mobile through any means available, including unauthorized modifications using railway supplies and improvised tools. He threaded the drain plug back into place, tightened it with the modified wrench, and slid out from beneath the Sherman. "Transmission fluid," he said to Kovach, and the lieutenant handed him a 5-gallon can. Earl poured 3 gallons into the transmission filler, replaced the cap, and wiped his hands on his coveralls. "Start her up. Check your gauges." Kovach climbed into the turret and gave the order. The Sherman's 4 GAA V8 engine coughed once, caught, and settled into its characteristic rumble. The transmission engaged smoothly. Track tension normal. Fluid pressure normal. The tank was operational. 41 minutes from breakdown to mobile, using a modified wrench and 63 cents worth of grease. "Outstanding work, Sergeant," Kovach said, his voice carrying relief and gratitude in equal measure. "Now get yourself to cover. We got incoming." Earl grabbed his tool bag and modified wrench and sprinted for a stone wall 50 yards away. Behind him, Kovach's Sherman was already traversing its turret toward the eastern ridge, where German infantry were becoming visible in the growing dawn light. The Battle of Mortain was beginning, and Earl Peterson's field modification was about to be tested under the most extreme conditions possible. The story of how a railroad mechanic's son from Wisconsin came to be lying under tanks in Normandy began 6 months earlier in the decidedly unwarlike environment of Madison, Wisconsin, where Earl Peterson had been working as a journeyman machinist at the Chicago and Northwestern Railway shops. Earl had been born on March 14, 1922, in the small town of Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, population approximately 8,000, located about 40 miles north of Madison. His father, Olaf Peterson, was a master mechanic for the railroad, specializing in locomotive and freight car maintenance. His mother, Margaret, kept house and raised Earl and his two younger sisters. The Peterson family was working class, not wealthy but comfortable, with the steady employment security that railroad work provided during the Depression years. Earl had grown up in the railway shops, spending afternoons and weekends watching his father repair coupling assemblies, bearing housings, and the massive reduction gearboxes that transmitted power from locomotive engines to the drive wheels. Olaf Peterson was an old-school mechanic who believed that understanding how things broke was more important than memorizing how they were supposed to work. He taught Earl to look at failure patterns, to read the story that worn metal told about stresses and forces and inadequate lubrication. By age 14, Earl could disassemble and rebuild a freight car journal box faster than most adult mechanics. By 16, he was working summer jobs in the railway shops, learning machining, welding, and the practical engineering that kept ton freight trains moving across the Midwest. When Earl graduated from Beaver Dam High School in 1940, there was never any question about what he'd do next. He went to work for the railroad full-time as an apprentice machinist, learning the trade properly through the formal apprenticeship program that the Chicago and Northwestern maintained. He was good at the work, demonstrating the combination of mechanical intuition and systematic problem-solving that separated master mechanics from parts replacers. His supervisors noted his ability to diagnose problems quickly, to see patterns that others missed, to improvise solutions when standard procedures didn't work. He completed his apprenticeship in 3 years instead of the usual 4, earning his journeyman papers in early 1943. By then, the war had been raging for more than a year. Most of Earl's high school classmates had been drafted or enlisted. Earl had received draft deferment as an essential worker in critical industry. Railroads were vital for moving war materials, troops, and supplies across the country. But the deferment felt increasingly hollow as casualty lists grew longer. In September 1943, Earl enlisted in the Army, requesting assignment to armored forces based on his mechanical background. The Army was delighted to have a trained machinist who understood heavy machinery and sent him to Fort Knox, Kentucky for basic training, followed by advanced individual training as an armored vehicle mechanic. The training was eye-opening. The Army's approach to maintenance was completely different from railroad practice. Railway maintenance emphasized prevention, systematic inspection, and addressing small problems before they became major failures. The railroad could schedule maintenance because trains ran on predictable routes at predictable times. Army maintenance doctrine assumed that vehicles would be operated until they broke, then fixed or replaced as quickly as possible. Combat imposed time pressures that eliminated the possibility of systematic prevention. This philosophy troubled Earl. He understood the logic. You can't schedule maintenance when you're being shot at. But he also understood that mechanical systems followed physical laws regardless of tactical situations. Gears that ran without lubrication would fail. Bearings subjected to shock loads would wear. Seals exposed to heat and pressure would degrade. The Army's approach was to accept these failures and minimize their impact through rapid replacement. Earl wondered whether there might be a third option: field modifications that prevented catastrophic failures without requiring depot-level facilities. He kept these thoughts to himself during training. The Army didn't encourage creative thinking from privates. He learned the official procedures for Sherman tank maintenance, memorized the technical manuals, and qualified as an expert in armored vehicle mechanics. He deployed to England in February 1944 as part of the massive buildup preceding the invasion of France. He spent 3 months at a depot in southern England, working on Shermans that were being prepared for D-Day, and it was during this period that he first noticed the final drive problem. Tanks that had been operated for 200 miles or more during training exercises were coming into the depot with final drive failures at alarming rates. The official solution was complete replacement of the final drive assembly, but the replacement units were failing just as quickly once the tanks returned to service. This pattern suggested that replacement wasn't solving the root cause. Earl began paying attention to how tank drivers operated their vehicles. He watched training exercises, noting the frequency of turns, the sharpness of maneuvers, the loads imposed on final drives during combat speed operations. He inspected failed units carefully, documenting wear patterns and failure modes. He read the technical manuals thoroughly, understanding the design intentions and identifying where those intentions diverged from operational reality. And he remembered his father's lessons about railway gearboxes, about heavy-grade lubricants, about the difference between preventing failure and repairing it. By the time the invasion began on June 6, 1944, Earl had a theory about what was actually failing and a preliminary idea about how to fix it. He would have exactly 5 weeks to test and refine his theory before it would be needed desperately at a small French town called Mortain. The German counteroffensive at Mortain was supposed to be impossible. American intelligence had concluded that the Wehrmacht lacked the strength, supplies, and operational capability to mount a major armored attack in early August 1944. The Germans had been retreating across Normandy for 3 weeks, their divisions shattered by the breakout from St-Lô, their supply lines collapsing under relentless Allied air attacks. Adolf Hitler disagreed with this assessment, and Hitler's disagreements with reality had a way of producing catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. On August 2, 1944, he personally ordered Operation Lüttich, a counterattack designed to drive through the American lines at Mortain, reach the coast at Avranches 30 miles west, and cut off General George Patton's Third Army, which had just broken through into Brittany and was racing toward the German heartland. The plan required concentrating 4 Panzer divisions, approximately 250 operational tanks, and attacking at night to negate Allied air superiority. German staff officers who privately believed the operation was suicidal kept those opinions to themselves and began moving forces into position. The attack began at 0200 hours on August 7th, catching American forces at Mortain almost completely by surprise. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich attacked from the east with 47 Panther tanks and 22 Panzer IV tanks, supported by approximately 12,000 infantry. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler attacked from the southeast with 31 operational tanks. Elements of 116th Panzer Division and 2nd Panzer Division provided additional pressure on the flanks. Against this force, the American 30th Infantry Division held Mortain with 4,000 men, no tanks of their own, and a handful of M10 tank destroyers whose 3-inch guns could penetrate German armor at close range, but were inadequate against the Panther's frontal armor. The initial German assault achieved complete surprise and rapid progress. They captured the eastern edge of Mortain within the first hour, pushing American infantry back into the town center. Panther tanks rolled through the darkness, their 75mm guns destroying American positions at ranges where return fire was impossible. By 0400 hours, German forces had penetrated 2 kilometers into American lines and were threatening to collapse the entire defensive position. Then the mechanical realities of armored warfare began asserting themselves. Panzer divisions in August 1944 were not the unstoppable force they had been in 1940. 4 years of continuous combat had depleted trained crews, exhausted maintenance facilities, and left the Wehrmacht dependent on increasingly complex tanks that required skilled mechanics and ample spare parts to keep operational. The Panther tank was mechanically sophisticated and chronically unreliable. Its final drives failed regularly, its transmission broke frequently, and its engine was prone to fires. German maintenance doctrine, like American doctrine, emphasized replacement rather than field repair, but by August 1944, replacement parts were increasingly scarce. When a Panther broke down during the Mortain attack, it usually stayed broken. The Das Reich Division began the attack with 47 operational Panthers. By 0600 hours, 11 had broken down with mechanical failures, reducing the attacking force by nearly 25% without a single enemy shot being fired. American forces at Mortain held grimly, trading space for time, falling back through the town while inflicting casualties on German infantry and waiting for reinforcements that were being rushed to the battle. Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division received orders to move to Mortain at 03:15 hours. They were positioned approximately 40 kilometers northwest, having just completed maintenance and resupply after the breakout from St. Lo. The Combat Command consisted of 3 tank companies with 17 Sherman tanks each, plus supporting infantry, artillery, and maintenance units. Among those maintenance units was Sergeant Earl Peterson and his modified wrench. The movement order came with minimal details. Enemy attack at Mortain, strength unknown, move immediately to reinforce 30th Infantry Division. Tank commanders started their engines and began road march without waiting for full tactical briefing. Speed mattered more than preparation when friendly forces were under attack. Earl rode in the maintenance section's half-track, bouncing along Norman roads in darkness, carrying his tool bag, his modified wrench, and 6 tins of railway coupling grease that had arrived in a care package from his father 3 days earlier. He'd requested the grease specifically in a letter home, explaining that it was useful for mechanical work without mentioning tanks or final drives or anything that sensors might delete. His father had sent 6 one-pound tins packed carefully in a wooden box with instructions to keep the bearings greased. Earl had immediately distributed 4 tins to other mechanics he'd trained in the modification procedure, keeping 2 for himself. By the time Combat Command B reached Mortain at 0600 hours, the battle had been raging for 4 hours. The town was partially in German hands. American infantry were fighting from buildings and hedgerows, and Panther tanks were visible on the eastern ridges, their long guns sweeping for targets. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hogan, commanding the 33rd Armored Regiment's element of CCB, assessed the tactical situation quickly. The Germans had penetrated deep, but had not achieved breakthrough. Their advance had stalled against determined American resistance and was vulnerable to armored counterattack from the flanks. Hogan ordered his Shermans to deploy in covered positions along the western edge of Mortain, where they could engage German armor attempting to push further west. The problem became apparent within minutes. Of the 51 Sherman tanks that CCB had brought to Mortain, 8 were showing final drive problems. The tanks would move, but sluggishly, with abnormal sounds from the drivetrains and visible fluid leaks beneath the hulls. These were tanks that had operated for 200–250 miles since the breakout from St. Lo, exactly the mileage range where Earl's pattern recognition had predicted failures. Under normal circumstances, these 8 tanks would be declared deadlined, evacuated to depot maintenance, and replaced with fresh vehicles from reserve stocks. But there were no reserve stocks at Mortain. Every operational tank was needed immediately. Earl didn't wait for orders. He grabbed his tool bag and modified wrench and approached the nearest disabled Sherman, a tank from Company A that was leaking transmission fluid at an alarming rate from both final drives. The crew commander, a staff sergeant named Williams, was standing beside the tank looking furious and helpless. "She's done, Peterson. Both sides are leaking. We're deadlined." "Not yet," Earl said, and dropped to the ground to slide beneath the tank. The next 47 minutes became a blur of mechanical work performed under combat conditions. Modified wrench on the right side drain plug, drain the contaminated fluid, inspect for metal particles indicating catastrophic wear, pack the final drive with railway grease, replace the plug, move to the left side, repeat the procedure, repeat for the next tank, and the next. Earl worked through the initial German artillery barrage that began at 0645 hours, shells impacting in the fields around Mortain as German forward observers tried to suppress American reinforcements. He worked through the small arms fire that intensified as German infantry pushed closer to American positions. He worked through the distinctive crack of German 75mm tank guns, engaging targets on the western ridge. Other mechanics joined him. Corporal James Mitchell, whom Earl had trained in the modification technique 2 weeks earlier, was working on another disabled Sherman 50 yards away. Private First Class Robert Chen, who'd learned the procedure by watching Earl work and asking questions, was under a third tank performing the same repair. 3 mechanics, with modified wrenches and railway grease, racing against time and German armor to keep American tanks operational. By 0730 hours, all 8 tanks that had shown final drive problems were back in operation. Not perfectly repaired, they would still need proper depot maintenance eventually, but mobile, combat-capable, and moving into firing positions. Lieutenant Colonel Hogan watched this minor miracle with the kind of appreciation that only comes from years of combat experience. He understood immediately that he'd just been given 8 additional tanks when he'd expected to fight with only 43. That 15% increase in combat power could determine whether his position held or collapsed. The Battle of Mortain continued for 6 more days, one of the most critical engagements of the Normandy campaign, and Earl Peterson's field modification became one of the invisible factors that determined the outcome. German forces attacked repeatedly, trying to break through American lines and reach the coast. American forces held, counterattacked, and gradually pushed the Germans back. Sherman tanks, that should have been immobilized by final drive failures, kept fighting because Earl and the mechanics he'd trained could repair them in under an hour using improvised tools and railway grease. The tactical impact was enormous. Combat Command B, which should have been reduced to 43 operational tanks by final drive failures, maintained 51 operational tanks throughout the critical first 3 days of battle. That 8-tank difference meant additional firepower at crucial moments, additional mobility for flanking maneuvers, and additional psychological pressure on German forces who were discovering that American armor wasn't breaking down as quickly as they'd expected. The pattern repeated across other American armored units at Mortain. The 2nd Armored Division, fighting on CCB's northern flank, had 12 mechanics who'd learned Earl's modification technique during the St. Lo fighting. Those 12 mechanics kept an additional 19 tanks operational that would normally have been deadlined. The 4th Armored Division, racing north from Brittany to reinforce Mortain, had 5 mechanics using the railway grease modification. They kept 13 tanks operational. Across the American forces engaged at Mortain, approximately 40 tanks that should have been immobilized by final drive failures remained combat effective because of Earl's 63-cent modification. 40 additional tanks meant 200 additional crewmen in the fight, 160 additional main gun tubes engaging German armor, 200 additional machine guns suppressing German infantry. In the brutal arithmetic of armored warfare, those numbers created a combat advantage that German commanders couldn't overcome. By August 10th, the German counteroffensive had clearly failed. They'd penetrated 7 kilometers at maximum advance, far short of the 30 kilometers needed to reach the coast. They'd lost 86 tanks destroyed or abandoned, including 23 Panthers that had broken down with mechanical failures and been destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. They'd suffered approximately 4,000 casualties killed, wounded, or captured. The Americans had held Mortain, contained the German advance, and begun their own counteroffensive that would eventually encircle and destroy much of the German force in the Falaise pocket. Military historians would later identify the Battle of Mortain as the moment when German defeat in Normandy became inevitable. American forces had demonstrated the ability to absorb a major armored counterattack, hold their positions, and counterattack effectively. German forces had demonstrated that they no longer possessed the strength, supplies, or mechanical reliability to execute operational-level offensives successfully. Nobody in the official histories mentioned that 40 American tanks had remained operational because a railroad mechanic's son had figured out how to pack final drives with coupling grease using a modified wrench. But the tank commanders knew, the battalion maintenance officers knew, and most importantly, word spread through the armored divisions with the speed that critical information always spreads among soldiers whose lives depend on keeping their equipment functional. By mid-August 1944, Earl Peterson's field modification was being performed throughout First Army's armored units without official sanction from Army Ordnance Department. Mechanics were modifying wrenches using field forges and bench grinders. Officers were writing letters home, requesting railway coupling grease. Tank crews were performing preventive maintenance on their own vehicles, draining and repacking final drives every 200 miles instead of waiting for catastrophic failure. The modification spread through informal networks, mechanic to mechanic, unit to unit, carried by men who understood that staying mobile meant staying alive. The German army noticed but couldn't determine what had changed. Intelligence reports from captured American tanks noted unusual lubricants in final drive assemblies, thick black grease that didn't match specifications in captured technical manuals. German maintenance officers analyzing American tank failures observed that Sherman final drives were lasting significantly longer than German intelligence estimates predicted. Panzer commanders reported that American tanks they'd expected to find immobilized by mechanical problems were instead appearing in unexpected positions, mobile and combat-ready. One German after-action report from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, captured when the unit was encircled in the Falaise pocket, noted specifically, American Sherman tanks demonstrate improved mechanical reliability compared to earlier assessments. Final drive failures, previously expected at 200-250 kilometer intervals, now appear to occur at 400-450 kilometer intervals. Cause unknown. Possible improved maintenance procedures or component modifications. The cause was Earl Peterson's 63-cent modification, but German intelligence never identified it. They assumed the Americans had made engineering improvements to the final drive design, perhaps upgraded metallurgy or improved seals. They never considered that the change was as simple as a modified wrench and thicker grease, applied by mechanics working under tanks in combat conditions. The American Army Ordnance Department took longer to notice than the Germans, which says something unflattering about military bureaucracy. Official reports of improved Sherman tank reliability began appearing in August 1944, but Ordnance Department analysts attributed the improvements to better driver training, improved supply of spare parts, and the cumulative effects of theater maintenance experience. Nobody at Ordnance Department headquarters in Detroit was aware that mechanics in France had developed and deployed an unauthorized field modification that was preventing thousands of final drive failures. The truth emerged in late September 1944 when a technical observer from the Ordnance Department, a civilian engineer named Harold Mitchell, visited 3rd Armored Division to investigate reports of unusually low final drive failure rates. Mitchell was a bearing specialist from SKF Industries, working under contract to evaluate combat effectiveness of various lubrication approaches. He expected to find improved maintenance procedures, or perhaps better quality control in replacement parts. Instead, he found Earl Peterson under a Sherman tank, repacking a final drive with railway coupling grease using a wrench with a 15-degree bent handle. Mitchell watched Earl work, asked technical questions, examined the modified wrench, inspected the grease composition, and requested data on failure rates before and after implementation of the modification. The data was startling. Before Earl's modification, 3rd Armored Division was deadlining an average of 4.2 Sherman tanks per week due to final drive failures. After widespread adoption of the modification in early August, the rate had dropped to 0.7 tanks per week, an 83% reduction in failure rate. Mitchell interviewed mechanics across the division and discovered that the modification had spread far beyond Earl's original work. Approximately 40 mechanics were now performing the procedure, having learned from Earl or from other mechanics he'd trained. The division had collectively performed more than 300 field modifications since early July, keeping tanks operational that would otherwise have required depot-level maintenance. Mitchell wrote a detailed technical report documenting the modification, its implementation, and its results. He recommended immediate official adoption across all armored units in the European theater. He specifically recommended that Sergeant Earl Peterson be assigned to Ordnance Department technical staff to train mechanics and develop improved field maintenance procedures. The report reached Ordnance Department headquarters in Detroit on October 12, 1944, where it created immediate controversy. One faction of engineers was enthusiastic. The modification was simple, effective, used readily available materials, and could be implemented without disrupting the supply chain or requiring new parts. It was exactly the kind of field innovation that should be encouraged and disseminated. Another faction was appalled. The modification was unauthorized, used non-standard materials, violated established maintenance procedures, and had been implemented without proper testing or approval. What if it caused failures rather than preventing them? What if tanks broke down in combat because mechanics had packed their final drives with railway grease instead of following proper procedures? The debate escalated to the Army Service Forces commander, Lieutenant General Brahan Somerville, who reviewed Mitchell's report and made a decision that was characteristically pragmatic. The modification worked. The data proved it worked. Hundreds of tanks were operational because it worked. Official adoption was approved effective November 1, 1944. Technical Bulletin TB-ORD-44 issued November 15, 1944, provided official instructions for emergency field maintenance of M4 series tank final drive assemblies. The bulletin described the drain plug access modification, specified railway coupling grease or equivalent SAE 140 weight extreme pressure lubricant, and provided step-by-step procedures for field implementation. The bulletin credited field maintenance personnel of 1st Army Armored Units for developing the technique without naming Earl Peterson specifically, which was typical of Army documentation that credited units rather than individuals. The bulletin was distributed to all armored units in Europe and also sent to units in the Pacific Theater, where Sherman tanks were experiencing similar final drive problems under different but equally challenging conditions. By December 1944, the modification was being performed across every theater where American forces operated Sherman tanks. The long-term impact extended far beyond keeping a few hundred tanks mobile during the Normandy campaign. The modification changed how the Army thought about field maintenance and the role of mechanics in combat effectiveness. Before Earl's work at Mortain, field maintenance was considered a necessary but essentially passive activity. Mechanics fixed things that broke, following procedures written by engineers at depots far from combat. The concept that mechanics in combat units might develop improvements to those procedures, might identify failure modes that depot engineers had missed, might create field modifications that prevented rather than repaired failures. This was not part of Army maintenance doctrine. Earl Peterson demonstrated that combat mechanics, working with limited tools and improvised materials, could solve problems that formal engineering organizations had failed to address. His success validated the idea that field experience and practical problem-solving were as valuable as theoretical engineering knowledge. The Army formalized this concept in early 1945 with the creation of field maintenance development teams, small groups of experienced combat mechanics assigned to identify recurring problems and develop field solutions. The teams were authorized to modify equipment, test alternative procedures, and recommend changes to technical manuals based on combat experience. This was revolutionary for a military organization that had traditionally maintained rigid separation between operators in the field and engineers at headquarters. By the end of the war, field maintenance development teams had developed or refined more than 200 different field modifications for various vehicles, weapons, and equipment, Not all were as impactful as Earl's final drive modification, but collectively, they represented a new approach to military maintenance that emphasized continuous improvement based on operational experience. Post-war tank design incorporated lessons learned from the Sherman final drive problems. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, which entered service in early 1945, featured improved final drive seals and a lubrication system that maintained positive pressure to prevent fluid leaks. The M46 Patton medium tank, developed immediately after the war, had completely redesigned final drives based partly on analysis of Sherman failures and Earl's modification. Soviet tank designers, who captured numerous Sherman tanks during the war and studied them intensively, noted the final drive problems in their own design work. The T-54 medium tank, which became the Soviet Army's standard tank for 3 decades, incorporated heavy-duty final drive seals and specified extreme pressure lubricants specifically to avoid the problems that had plagued the Sherman. British tank designers reached similar conclusions. The Centurion tank, which entered service in 1945, featured robust final drive assemblies with multiple redundant seals and provision for field maintenance without removing tracks. The modification's influence appeared in civilian applications as well. After the war, heavy equipment manufacturers consulted with military maintenance specialists about field reliability improvements. Caterpillar Tractor Company, which had manufactured many of the final drive assemblies used in Sherman tanks, incorporated lessons learned into their post-war bulldozer and earth mover designs. International Harvester applied similar principles to their construction equipment. The general concept that field maintainability and ease of lubrication were as important as initial engineering elegance became standard practice in heavy equipment design. Earl Peterson's personal recognition came slowly and incompletely, which was typical for soldiers whose contributions were technical rather than tactical. He was awarded the Bronze Star Medal in November 1944 for exceptionally meritorious service in support of combat operations. The citation mentioned his development and implementation of innovative maintenance procedures that significantly improved vehicle readiness, without specifying the final drive modification or quantifying its impact. He was promoted to technical sergeant in December 1944 and assigned to 1st Army Ordnance Headquarters as a technical advisor on field maintenance procedures. This was essentially a reward posting, taking him out of direct combat while allowing him to continue his work on maintenance improvements. He spent the final 6 months of the war training mechanics, refining field procedures, and serving as liaison between combat units and Ordnance Department engineers. He was present when American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River in April 1945, witnessing the end of the European War from a maintenance depot rather than a combat unit. Earl mustered out of the Army in December 1945 and returned to Wisconsin, where he resumed work for the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. His father had retired by then, but Earl's reputation as a master mechanic had preceded him. He was immediately offered a position as shop foreman at the Madison Maintenance Facility, supervising 20 mechanics and overseeing major repairs on locomotives and rolling stock. He never spoke much about his wartime service. When asked, he'd mentioned that he'd been a tank mechanic in Europe, that he'd been at Mortain and the Battle of the Bulge, that he'd done maintenance work. He didn't mention that his modification had kept hundreds of tanks operational, that military historians would later credit improved Sherman reliability as one factor in the successful Normandy campaign, that his 63-cent fix had influenced tank design for decades. He married in 1947, raised 3 children, and worked for the railroad until his retirement in 1982. He died in Madison in 1994 at age 72. His obituary noting his service in World War II and his 40-year career with the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. The modified wrench was donated to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison by his son in 1998, where it's displayed in the World War II section with a small placard explaining its significance. Museum visitors often walk past it without pausing, seeing only a bent wrench in a display case, not recognizing it as the tool that kept American armor mobile during critical battles. The final drive modification itself remained relevant far longer than anyone expected. When the United States military began providing Sherman tanks to Allied nations after the war, the modification procedures were included in maintenance manuals. Israel operated Sherman tanks extensively from the 1950s through the 1970s, upgrading them with modern engines and guns, but still dealing with the same final drive problems that had plagued American forces in 1944. Israeli Defense Forces mechanics used Earl's modification technique, adapted slightly for different grease specifications, but following the same basic principles. Pakistan, Chile, and other nations that operated Sherman tanks into the 1970s and 1980s used similar procedures. The last Sherman tanks in combat service were retired by Paraguay in the late 1990s, more than 50 years after Earl Peterson first modified a wrench and repacked a final drive under artillery fire at Mortain. The broader lesson about field innovation and bottom-up problem-solving proved more enduring than any specific technical modification. Modern military maintenance doctrine explicitly recognizes that combat mechanics often identify problems and develop solutions faster than formal engineering organizations. Field maintenance teams are now standard in all branches of service, authorized to modify equipment within specified parameters and to recommend changes based on operational experience. The concept of soldier-level innovation, which Earl Peterson exemplified without ever using that term, has become part of military culture. Contemporary examples abound. In Iraq and Afghanistan, vehicle crews developed improvised armor for Humvees before factory-built armored variants became available. Maintenance teams modified air filters and cooling systems to handle desert conditions. Soldiers developed field-expedient solutions to problems that engineers at depots hadn't anticipated. Each of these innovations followed the same pattern that Earl demonstrated in 1944. Identify the actual failure mode, understand the physical mechanism, develop a simple fix using available materials, test under operational conditions, and disseminate through informal networks. The United States Army Ordnance Corps established the Earl Peterson Award in 1997, given annually to maintenance personnel who demonstrate exceptional innovation in field support of combat operations. The award citation describes Earl's work at Mortain and his influence on military maintenance doctrine. Recipients receive a replica of the modified wrench, cast in bronze, mounted on a wooden plaque. It's a small recognition, mostly unknown outside the maintenance community, but it represents something important about how wars are actually won. Not just through grand strategy or tactical brilliance, but through thousands of small innovations by ordinary soldiers solving practical problems with whatever tools and materials they have available. Earl Peterson never commanded troops in battle, never planned operations, never appeared in newsreels or newspaper photographs. He fixed tanks. He fixed them well enough and fast enough that American armor stayed mobile when German armor was breaking down. He did it with a bent wrench and railway grease, asking nothing more than the satisfaction of keeping his fellow soldiers alive and mobile. That's the story military historians should remember when they write about the Normandy campaign and the Battle of Mortain. Not just the grand sweeps of armies across maps, but the 19-year-old railroad mechanic who spent 47 minutes under a Sherman tank while German artillery fell around him, packing final drives with grease, because he understood that mobility wins wars and immobilized tanks are just expensive bunkers. The Germans at Mortain learned this lesson the hard way. They attacked with 250 tanks and watched 86 break down or get destroyed. They expected American tanks to break down at the same rate and discovered that American mechanics had figured out how to keep them running. That differential, American mobility versus German mechanical failure, determined the outcome as surely as any tactical decision made by generals. In the end, the Battle of Mortain wasn't won by superior strategy or better tanks. It was won by mechanics with modified wrenches who understood that wars are fought with machines, and machines only work if someone knows how to fix them.